I'd been on the road for what felt like an eternity, at least 2 hours, headed for the Marriott in Baltimore. My wife Claire was attending a conference there, and I had convinced myself that surprising her with dinner would be a good idea. But the truth was, I had a deeper reason for making the drive. For 3 long months, a nagging suspicion had been eating away at me, refusing to let me rest. I couldn't shake the feeling that Claire was seeing someone else. Every time she attended one of these work conferences, she returned later than expected, acting a little too cheerful, or, at times, unusually distant. Tonight, I had resolved to confront this feeling head-on and find out what was really going on. Claire and I had been married for 14 years. We had 2 wonderful kids, Sarah, 12, and Jake, 10, who were staying with my mom that night. Claire and I got married right out of high school after dating for a few years. She'd always been this bright, warm woman, her long brown hair and radiant smile lighting up every room she entered. But lately, things had changed. Little habits she once had, the way she looked at me, the excitement she once showed when we spent time together, seemed to fade. I didn't want to come off as paranoid or possessive, so I had tried to brush it off. But this conference was close enough for me to make an unannounced visit, and the timing felt too perfect to ignore. When I finally arrived, I checked in and handed my suit bag to the front desk clerk. "My name's Adam Taylor," I explained, trying to sound casual. "My wife, Claire Taylor, is attending the insurance conference. She's in room 214, and she told me I could grab a spare key." After a quick ID check, the clerk handed me a key card, and I headed toward the elevator, feeling my pulse hammer in my ears. Questions raced through my mind. What if I walked in and she wasn't alone? What if I found her in the arms of another man? I tried to push the thoughts aside, but as I slid the key card into the door, I braced myself. Slowly, I opened it, holding my breath, and there she was, sitting at the desk, her briefcase open, sifting through paperwork. When she turned and saw me, her look of surprise was genuine, and for a moment I felt foolish. I had come here ready for a confrontation, yet here she was, acting every bit the busy professional. "Hey," I said, offering a smile. "I had some free time and thought I'd surprise you with dinner." Claire's face softened, and she looked genuinely happy to see me. "Oh, I'm so glad you came. Stay the night," she suggested, giving me a warm kiss that momentarily dissolved my suspicions. She seemed thrilled at the prospect of spending the evening together. But just as I was starting to feel relieved, she gave me a mischievous smile and joked that maybe we could have a quick moment together before dinner. My suspicions faded, and we shared a brief, intimate moment before she excused herself to shower. I took a deep breath, wondering if I had just let my own paranoia get the best of me. To distract myself, I scanned the room, my eyes landing on her toiletry bag on the dresser. Thinking I'd grab some aspirin to ease my headache from the drive, I unzipped it. But what I found wasn't aspirin. Instead, I pulled out a pack of condoms. The sight of them made my stomach drop. Claire had switched to birth control pills after Jake was born, but when they caused side effects, I'd decided to get a vasectomy. We hadn't needed any kind of contraception since, so why would she have condoms now? There was only one explanation. As the realization hit me, I felt my anger flare. I couldn't let this go. Desperate for a plan, I grabbed a safety pin from her bag and carefully poked holes in each condom, then placed them back as I'd found them. I knew it was a petty move, but at that moment, it felt like I was reclaiming some control. While Claire finished her shower, I quickly texted my best friend Rob. He was the type of friend who would do anything without asking questions. I told him I needed a favor, a phone call in about an hour. Something urgent, like a burst pipe at the school, that would give me an excuse to leave. Rob agreed without hesitation, saying he'd call around 7 tal. When Claire finally emerged from the bathroom, I forced a smile and tried to act natural, though I could barely stand to look at her. Every ounce of me wanted to confront her, to demand an explanation, but I knew I needed to keep calm. We went down to the hotel's dining room, and I did my best to act normal while everything inside me was unraveling. As we sat down at the table, I couldn't resist testing her. "Are you happy with our marriage?" I asked, hoping to see a crack in her mask. Without a hint of hesitation, Claire smiled and said, "Of course I am. We have a great home, 2 wonderful kids, and a husband who loves me." She went on about how grateful she was, and how lucky we were to have each other. Her words stung. How could she say these things while betraying me? Keeping my tone steady, I admitted that I sometimes worried I was I felt restless. While Claire was busy unpacking, I couldn't resist the urge to check her bag again, despite the guilt gnawing at me. There it was. One last condom, still with the tiny hole I'd poked in it. How many had she gone through in just a few days? The thought turned my stomach. The following Saturday, Liberty Insurance, where Claire worked, hosted a family picnic for employees. Our kids, Sarah and Jake, were thrilled about it, but I dreaded the event. I had this gut feeling that some of her colleagues might be aware of the affair, and I couldn't stand the idea of becoming the subject of their office gossip or crude jokes. I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, but after everything I'd seen, it was hard to shake the feeling. At the picnic, Claire was in her element, laughing and chatting comfortably with her co-workers, including Tom. They weren't openly affectionate, but there was an undeniable closeness between them. They stood a little too close, their conversation flowing as if everyone around them faded into the background. I kept a low profile, unwilling to draw attention to myself. Then, a woman I hadn't met before walked over and introduced herself as Janet Bradley, Tom's wife. She was strikingly beautiful, long auburn hair and deep blue eyes, the kind of woman who looked like she'd stepped right out of a magazine. For a moment, I was genuinely confused. How could Tom possibly cheat on someone like her? I had always loved Claire, but standing next to Janet, I couldn't help but feel she was in a league of her own. After a few minutes of small talk, Janet suggested we find a quieter spot to chat. We ended up on a secluded bench near the lake, far enough from the picnic area that we could speak openly. Janet seemed hesitant at first, clearly struggling to find the right words. Finally, I decided to make it easier for her. I told her that I had found out about the affair just that week. Instantly, I saw the relief wash over her face. Janet admitted she had known for a couple of months and had already filed for divorce. She had even hired a private investigator to collect evidence. Her lawyer had advised her to ask Claire to testify or at least sign a notarized statement about the affair to strengthen her case. I asked about the kind of evidence she had, and she mentioned photos, phone recordings, and a few hotel receipts. While there were no videos yet, she believed what she had was strong enough to stand up in court. Then, she asked if I'd consider using some of the evidence in my own divorce proceedings. Janet was also planning to sue Liberty Insurance for negligence. She had statements from other employees who were aware of the affair but did nothing. Janet was determined to make both Tom and Claire face the consequences. She suggested we work together, sharing whatever evidence we had, and I agreed. It felt like a small step toward reclaiming control over the mess my life had become. Before heading back to the picnic, Janet invited me over to her house the next day to go through everything she'd gathered. Tom was planning to golf that morning, so it would be a good time to review everything undisturbed. She lived at 26 Hemlock Avenue in Crestmont, just a short drive from where we were. When we got back, it seemed no one had noticed our absence, and I felt a surprising sense of relief. For the first time, I felt like there might be a way out of this nightmare. The next morning, Claire left the house, saying she was heading out for some shopping. As soon as she was gone, I dropped the kids off with my mom and drove over to Janet's. She greeted me at the door, calm and composed, and led me into her den, a cozy room with a large leather couch and a computer monitor positioned on the table, showing a grainy video feed of an empty motel room. Janet gestured for me to sit down and offered me a drink. I opted for a Pepsi, trying to stay level-headed. Janet explained that we were about to watch Tom's golf game in full color and hinted that I might recognize his companion on the course. When I asked how she managed to set all this up, she shrugged casually, saying it cost her around $400. Tom can cover it one way or another, she added with a bitter smile. She'd set everything up so that we'd have a couple of hours to watch. She even had snacks ready, popcorn and nachos, and promised me a DVD of the recording afterward. She admitted that, while she didn't exactly want to see what was going to unfold, she couldn't look away. Neither could I. For the next 20 minutes, we made small talk. Janet showed me the damning photos, played recorded conversations, and laid out documents, each piece a painful confirmation of how deeply Claire and Tom were entangled. Then, as Janet had predicted, the monitor flickered to life, and there they were, Tom and Claire walking into the motel room together. There was no hesitation, no idle conversation. They barely closed the door before starting to undress. It was all painfully clear. This was it, the proof I had dreaded but knew I needed. The sound from the video feed was a little muffled, but the scene unfolding on the monitor was unmistakable. There she was, my wife, right in front of me, with another man. Watching Claire and Tom together like that was gut-wrenching, one of the most uncomfortable experiences of my life. Janet, trying to lighten the mood, made a half-hearted comment about how Claire sure knew how to keep in shape. I managed a forced smile, but inside, I was reeling. It felt surreal, and I didn't want to watch another second. After a few more painful minutes, I turned to Janet. "I think I've seen enough," I said, unable to hide the disgust in my voice. Janet sighed, nodding. "Yeah, it's hard to watch." She agreed to turn it off, mentioning that the lawyers had more than enough evidence by now. Sitting there, I confessed that seeing Claire like this, especially with Janet right next to me, felt unbearable. Janet gave a sympathetic nod, suggesting we find something else to do. Relieved, I welcomed the distraction when she mentioned showing me her koi ponds in the backyard. Her face lit up as she described her hobby, and I was glad to follow her outside, leaving the sting of betrayal behind, if only for a moment. As we walked out to her backyard, I couldn't help but notice how much better this afternoon was turning out for me than it was for Claire. Janet's koi ponds were nothing short of impressive. She had 3 in total, each pond larger and more vibrant than the last. She explained the pumps and filtration systems in detail, and given my own background in plumbing, I found myself genuinely interested. I offered to help her out if she ever needed an extra set of hands. Spending time with Janet felt oddly comforting, even though the connection wasn't romantic, at least not yet. We spent hours out there, talking about anything but our unfaithful spouses, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. Eventually, we returned inside, and I noticed the motel room feed was now empty. Tom and Claire had left. Janet promised to call me when Tom had his next golf game, and even suggested I bring the kids along to see the koi ponds. "Something to look forward to," she said with a small smile. As I drove home, I felt a strange mixture of emotions: relief, anger, and even a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I could get through this. In the following weeks, I found myself compulsively checking Claire's bag every time she took a shower. Each time there seemed to be a new supply of condoms. I couldn't figure out when she was even using them, but it felt as though she had an entirely separate life, one I wasn't a part of. I kept a safety pin ready on my keychain, ready to poke holes in each new stash. Meanwhile, I took the kids over to Janet's whenever Tom had a golf game, and they quickly became fond of her, calling her the koi lady. They'd come home with drawings of the fish, proudly showing them to Claire, who remained oblivious to the connection between Janet and Tom. On a few occasions, I tried talking to Claire about quitting her job and ending things with Tom, but each time she shot me down with cold indifference. Her rejections became increasingly harsh, and one night she even hinted that I was the problem in the marriage. Her words stung, but they also solidified my resolve. I started avoiding intimacy altogether, each rejection building a wall of distance between us. Then, one evening, Claire casually mentioned needing time to unwind and suggested visiting her sister Nancy for a few days. She framed it as a way for both of us to relax, given all the overtime and stress she assumed I was under. I barely slept that night, my mind racing as I pieced together my plan. The next morning, after Claire left for her supposed rest and relaxation trip, I called my parents and filled them in on the situation. Admitting to my failings as a husband wasn't easy, but they were supportive and offered to take the kids for as long as needed. The kids were thrilled to stay with their grandparents, and my dad's truck would be perfect for moving Claire's things out of the house. On Thursday, I set out for the family planning center, where I suspected Claire would be, under the guise of her visit to Nancy. Playing it cool, I walked up to the receptionist and introduced myself as Adam Taylor, pretending that Claire had sent me to sign some consent forms. I feigned confusion, saying I didn't know the form's exact title, but knew it had something to do with understanding the procedure and waiving liability. The receptionist checked the computer and confirmed Claire's details, mentioning that Nancy had already signed on her behalf, but that my signature would be preferable. She handed me the form, and I signed quickly, right under Nancy's signature. Claire's procedure was scheduled for Friday at 11 a.m., with instructions to arrive an hour early. I asked if there were any payments outstanding, but the receptionist assured me it was all covered. Claire had paid the full $800 in cash. I thanked her, leaving with a mix of relief and anxiety. When I arrived unannounced at Nancy and Brad's house later that evening, Claire seemed genuinely surprised. She asked what I was doing there, and I explained that my parents had the kids for a few days, so I'd taken time off work to unwind myself. The room went silent, and I could practically see the wheels turning in her mind as she tried to figure out how to respond. Nancy and Brad's discomfort was almost tangible. Brad suggested we take his friend Jack's boat out on the lake the next day, hoping to diffuse the tension. I agreed, though I had no intention of actually going. The following morning, I watched as they prepared for their outing, standing by the truck door without any intention of joining them. Brad finally got the hint, swore a little, then left without me. With them gone, I poured myself a cup of coffee, turned off Claire's phone, and called my dad. We chatted for a couple of hours, ignoring the constant buzzing of call-waiting tones. I figured Brad was trying to warn Nancy, but I wasn't about to let that happen. Eventually, Nancy and Claire came downstairs, clearly rattled but resigned to my presence. When Nancy's phone buzzed back to life, it was 5 minutes before their appointment at the Family Planning Center. I watched them exchange irritated glances but said nothing. As we sat together, I casually suggested we find a nice place for lunch. Claire shot down the idea, saying they had personal errands to run, which didn't involve me. She mentioned bras and nightgowns, items she said would make me feel out of place. Feigning indifference, I offered to drive them to the mall and let them do their thing while I waited around. Reluctantly, they agreed, realizing they had little choice. When we arrived at the mall, I took my time filling the gas tank, checking the oil and cleaning the windshield, watching as they fumed in silence. We finally parked and entered the mall, and while they shopped, I stayed nearby, making sure they knew I wasn't going anywhere. By noon, they were clearly frustrated, but I had no intention of leaving. We met in the food court and headed to Olive Garden for lunch. The tension during the meal was palpable, and I knew they were itching to get back to their plans. But it was too late now. The appointment window had passed, and Claire would have to reschedule. As we drove back to Nancy's, the silence was thick with unspoken words. I had no doubt the next confrontation would be intense, but for now, I had regained a small measure of control. I could tell both Nancy and Claire were furious with me, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had the upper hand. Once back at the house, I settled on the couch with a cold beer, feeling surprisingly satisfied. A couple of hours later, Brad returned, only to be met with a furious outburst from Nancy that seemed to last forever. When she finally let up, Brad made himself scarce, slipping out of the house until dinner time. After dinner, I asked Claire if we could talk privately in the kitchen. Nancy shot me a glare but said nothing as Claire and I moved to another room. Claire's resentment was written all over her face, but I had no intention of backing down. Without hesitation, I told her once again that I wanted her to quit her job and end her relationship with Tom Bradley. Her jaw clenched in silent rage, and her body language screamed defiance. She insisted that she was tired of hearing this demand, that nothing would change, and gave me an ultimatum: either drop it or leave. But I wasn't leaving. Instead, I calmly reached into a manila envelope I'd brought along and pulled out another, thicker envelope inside it. Sliding it across the table, I told her that the envelope contained divorce papers. I reminded Claire that I'd asked her at least 10 times over the past 2 months to end things with Tom, but every time she had refused. "You can sign these papers and mail them in," I said, even including a self-addressed stamped envelope for her convenience. I added that she was welcome to have a lawyer review them, but my patience was done. Claire's face twisted with rage as she hissed that I couldn't divorce her just because I didn't like her job or her friendship with Tom. According to her, I had no grounds for divorce, no evidence of any wrongdoing. Then she had the audacity to tell me to go home and get my act together. I said nothing at first, only reached back into the envelope and pulled out a stack of photos. One by one, I laid them on the table, each picture capturing Claire and Tom in various compromising positions. "Is this enough grounds for you?" I asked. Claire's face went pale, and for a moment, I thought she might pass out. But instead of showing remorse, she launched into a tirade, accusing me of spying on her, calling me sneaky and underhanded. My phone rang at that moment. It was my dad, calling to let me know he'd be arriving shortly with Claire's belongings. I hung up and turned to her, explaining that the call was about her stuff, which my dad would be bringing to Nancy's place. I let her know I'd already changed the locks at our house, and if she'd forgotten anything, she could let me know and I'd retrieve it. She sat there, stunned. I handed her the title to her car, signed over to her, and an envelope containing half of our joint savings, around $200,000. I outlined her visitation rights with the kids, limited to once a week and one overnight visit per month, pending a notarized statement admitting to her affair. Then I mentioned the 2-hour video recording from her rendezvous at the Scandia Motel, dated May 10th. Collecting the photos, I told her I hadn't taken them myself. I wasn't that interested in tracking her every move. What I couldn't stand was being lied to. Finally, I pulled out a small item I'd kept in the envelope, the safety pin. Sliding it across the table, I calmly explained that I'd used it to poke holes in each condom she'd been using for the past 2 months. 48 condoms in 2 weeks, I added, noting the frequency. Her face turned red with fury and disbelief as she called me a miserable weasel. But I stood my ground, telling her the most miserable thing was her betrayal of our marriage. My dad's truck pulled into the driveway, and as I stood up to leave, I reminded her that she had never apologized. As I walked out, I wished her well with her procedure that Monday. That's when the tears came. Claire broke down, and I could hear Nancy rushing in to comfort her. Brad followed me out onto the porch, trying to make sense of what had happened. He suggested that I shouldn't throw away 14 years of marriage over a misunderstanding. I asked him why, if it was all just a misunderstanding. Claire had even come to see him and Nancy. Brad looked down, muttering an apology as he helped me unload Claire's things from the truck. In the weeks that followed, things fell into place. Both Claire and Tom were fired from Liberty Insurance. Claire refused to sign Janet's requested affidavit, but my lawyer assured me our case was strong without it. Claire disappeared from our lives, and although the kids didn't seem to miss her, they bonded with Janet, who quickly became an anchor in our little family. Months later, both divorces were finalized. Claire didn't fight hers, but Tom fought tooth and nail, only to lose everything: his house, his investments, and a hefty monthly alimony to Janet. Just before Christmas, Claire showed up with gifts for the kids. I decided not to stir any drama, letting her play the doting mother for a couple of hours. When she left, I felt an unexpected sense of closure. The house sold 2 months later, and by spring, I had moved in with Janet. Life felt peaceful, like I'd finally emerged from a long, dark tunnel. Months later, word got around that Tom had been mugged outside his favorite bar, beaten so severely that he'd suffered broken ribs and lost his wallet, and more. I couldn't say I felt any sympathy. Meanwhile, Janet and I grew closer, not just as partners, but as a family. The kids and I spent countless hours learning about koi, enjoying quiet days in Janet's backyard. By June, we were planning a wedding, ready to start a fresh chapter together. The journey Adam faced illustrates a transformation born out of betrayal, resilience, and ultimately, healing. It is often in moments of deep emotional rupture that people find the courage to make decisions they'd previously thought impossible. Renowned American psychologist Carl Jung suggested that the foundation of all mental illness is the unwillingness to experience legitimate suffering. In Adam's case, his ability to confront Claire's betrayal head-on, rather than ignore or rationalize it, allowed him to process his pain and rebuild a life rooted in honesty and mutual respect. His story reminds us that even after profound hurt, a renewed sense of purpose and connection is possible. Betrayal, though shattering, often becomes a catalyst for growth and clarity, helping people forge lives truer to their values. As Adam and Janet move forward, their new beginning is a testament to the resilience of the human heart.